The train lurched through the Alabama darkness, metal wheels screeching against rails that had carried countless young men toward uncertain destinies. Inside the colored car, pressed shoulder to shoulder on wooden benches worn smooth by generations of travelers, Private James Walker stared through the smudged window at his own reflection. 22 years old, broad-shouldered from years working his father's tobacco farm in North Carolina, he wore the same olive-drab uniform as every other soldier heading to war. But the sign above his head reading colored only reminded him that even in uniform, even sworn to die for his country, he remained separate. Across from him, Corporal Raymond Hayes cleaned his fingernails with a pocket knife, the blade catching occasional flashes of light from passing towns. Hayes had enlisted from Detroit, where he'd worked the assembly lines at Ford, and carried himself with the wary confidence of a man who'd learned early that America's promise of equality stopped at certain doors. He'd told James during their first week of training that he didn't expect thanks, didn't expect fairness, expected only to do his job well enough that no white officer could question his courage. That had been 6 months ago, before they'd been assigned to the 92nd Infantry Division, before they'd learned that their division's Italian campaign would be constantly undermined by commanders who believed black men couldn't fight. The train slowed at a station somewhere in Georgia. Through the window, James watched white soldiers pour into a cafe, laughing, slapping each other's backs, while a group of black troops stood outside in the rain, waiting for the colored entrance around back. A military policeman stood between the two groups like a sentinel guarding an invisible wall. James felt the familiar heat rising in his chest, the same anger that had sustained him through every humiliation of basic training, through every white officer who'd spoken to him like he was a child, through every assignment to labor details while white units received combat training. "Don't let it eat you," Hayes said quietly, noticing James's clenched jaw. "Save it for the Germans. They're the enemy we can actually shoot," but the words felt hollow even as Hayes spoke them. Both men knew the truth that black soldiers whispered in their segregated barracks after lights out. They were fighting two wars, one against fascism abroad and another against the racism that shadowed every step of their service. The blood they would spill on foreign soil would be kept separate in Red Cross banks, labeled colored as if their sacrifice carried a different color than white men's deaths. Their heroism would be filtered through reports written by officers who'd already decided they were inferior. Their victories would be credited to other units, their failures magnified, their existence rendered invisible in the grand narrative of American triumph. The 92nd Infantry Division shipped out from Newport News in July 1944, bound for Italy, where Allied forces were grinding their way up the mountainous peninsula against fierce German resistance. James stood on deck as America disappeared behind the gray Atlantic horizon, wondering if he'd ever see home again, wondering if dying for a country that despised him made him a hero or a fool. Around him, 5,000 black soldiers wondered the same thing, their silence more eloquent than any speech about duty or honor. Italy struck James first as heat and dust, the port of Naples shimmering in Mediterranean summer, buildings still bearing scars from Allied bombing. The 92nd moved north toward the Gothic Line, where German forces had fortified the Apennine Mountains into a nearly impregnable barrier. The terrain was brutal, vertical limestone ridges and narrow valleys where every meter had to be won through blood. White divisions had been battering against these defenses for months, making minimal progress. The segregated supply system meant the 92nd often received worn equipment, outdated maps, insufficient ammunition. White officers rotated through their command positions, many openly resentful of leading black troops, many convinced before the first shot was fired that their soldiers would fail. Colonel Harrison, their battalion commander, had told them during the first briefing that he'd never wanted this assignment, that he considered the whole experiment of black combat troops a mistake, but that he expected them to at least try not to embarrass the army. James carried those words into the mountains like stones in his pack. The first firefight came on a morning when fog clung to the valleys like cotton, reducing visibility to meters. James's platoon was advancing along a ridgeline toward a small village that intelligence reported as lightly defended. The first burst of German machine gun fire shattered the quiet with shocking violence, bullets snapping through the air with sounds like tearing fabric. Men dropped, screaming, bleeding into the rocky soil. James threw himself behind a boulder, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his skull. "Return fire," Sergeant Williams was shouting, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "Spread out, find cover." James forced his training to override his terror, brought his M1 Garand to his shoulder, searched for targets through the smoke and confusion. There, movement near a stone wall. He fired, the rifle's kick solid against his shoulder, fired again, saw the German soldier stumble backward. Around him, his platoon was responding with disciplined volleys despite the ambush. despite the fear, despite every stereotype that said they couldn't be soldiers. The battle lasted 4 hours, a grinding exchange of fire across broken ground where every advance was measured in bodies. They took the village by late afternoon, clearing buildings room by room, finding 6 dead Germans and evidence that the main force had withdrawn. The cost was 7 men from James's company killed, 19 wounded. They'd accomplished their objective, broken through a position that had held against white units for a week. The official report, written by Colonel Harrison, stated that the 92nd had advanced with considerable hesitation and displayed poor tactical discipline. No mention of the 7 dead. No mention that they'd held under fire. No mention that they'd won. That night, digging foxholes in the rocky soil, Hayes said to James, "We could take Rome itself, and they'd say we got lost on the way, across the Atlantic, in a different war that was somehow the same war." Sergeant David Robinson guided his M4 Sherman tank through French countryside that seemed impossibly green after the dust of training grounds back in Louisiana. The 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers as they'd named themselves, had landed at Omaha Beach in October 1944, months after the initial invasion, assigned to Patton's Third Army for the final push into Germany. Robinson commanded his tank from the turret, where he could see the road ahead and watch for the telltale signs of German resistance. His crew, 4 men he'd trained with for 2 years, moved with practiced efficiency in the cramped interior. Private Thomas Washington handled the bow machine gun, his Alabama accent thick enough to cut with a knife. Corporal Miguel Santos, whose Puerto Rican heritage put him in the colored units, served as gunner with steady hands and sharper eyes. Private Ernest Young drove with the skill of a Chicago taxi veteran, navigating shell-cratered roads and muddy fields with equal competence. Together they'd survived 3 weeks of near-constant combat, learned to work as a single organism encased in 30 tons of steel. The tankers had their own special burden. Unlike infantry, who could blend into landscape, tanks announced their presence with engine roar and ground tremor. They drew fire like lightning rods, faced German 88mm guns that could punch through their armor like paper, burned when hit with intensity that gave crews seconds to escape. Robinson had already lost friends, watched Shermans brew up into funeral pyres, heard the screaming from inside buttoned-up tanks that had become ovens. But they also had power. When infantry needed walls demolished, when machine gun nests needed silencing, when German counterattacks needed breaking, the 761st answered. They'd fought in 6 countries, liberated dozens of towns, destroyed enough German armor to fill a cemetery of steel. General Patton himself, despite his known prejudices, had told them before their first action that he didn't care what color they were, only whether they could kill Germans. It was the closest thing to respect any of them had received from the white command structure. The town of Tillet, Belgium, November 1944, German forces had launched a surprise counterattack, breaking through Allied lines, threatening to encircle American infantry. The 761st received orders to hold the road junction at all costs. Robinson's company, 5 tanks, took positions on the outskirts as civilians fled past them, carrying children and whatever possessions they could salvage. The Germans came at dawn, a column of Panthers and infantry supported by artillery. The first shells landed among the buildings behind Robinson's position, throwing up geysers of stone and fire. Through his periscope, he watched the German tanks emerge from the tree line, massive and lethal, their long 75mm guns traversing to acquire targets. "Gunner Panther, 11 o'clock, 700 meters," Robinson called. Santos was already swinging the turret. Identified. Fire. The Sherman bucked as the 76mm gun discharged. The breech slamming backward in recoil, spent shell casing clanging against the turret floor. Robinson watched the tracer arc across the field, strike the Panther's frontal armor, ricochet harmlessly into the sky. The German tank's heavier armor shrugged off their shot, load armor piercing. Robinson commanded, knowing it wouldn't be enough. Knowing the Panther could kill them from ranges where they couldn't hurt it, knowing they had to try anyway because American infantry depended on them holding this position, the Panther fired. The round missed by meters, detonating against a building and showering their tank with debris. Santos fired again, this shot catching the German tank in the track, immobilizing it but not destroying it. 2 more Panthers were advancing, along with a dozen infantry. For 6 hours, the 761st held Tillet against overwhelming odds, trading shot for shot with superior German armor, supporting surrounded American infantry, taking casualties they couldn't afford. Robinson's tank was hit twice, minor damage that left them operational but shaken. The tank to his left brewed up after a direct hit, only the driver escaping. But they didn't break, didn't retreat, held that junction until reinforcements arrived and the German attack collapsed. The battle report credited a white tank destroyer unit that had arrived in the final hour. 761st wasn't mentioned. That evening, Robinson sat on his tank's engine deck, smoking a cigarette and watching the sunset paint the Belgian sky in shades of amber and rose. A white lieutenant from the infantry unit they'd saved approached, young and visibly shaken, and extended his hand. "I wanted to thank you," he said quietly. "We'd all be dead or captured without you." Robinson shook his hand, nodded, said nothing. What was there to say? That this moment of recognition was rarer than enemy fire. That tomorrow they'd be back to being invisible, their heroism erased, their sacrifice footnoted if mentioned at all. The lieutenant seemed to sense the weight of silence. "It isn't right," he said. "None of this is right." "No," Robinson agreed. "But it's what we have. 5,000 miles from Belgian mud and Italian mountains." Captain Marcus Hayes of the 332nd Fighter Group climbed into the cockpit of his P-51 Mustang as dawn broke over the Italian airfield. The Tuskegee Airmen, as they'd become known, were the only black pilots in the Army Air Forces, products of a segregated training program in Alabama that had been designed as much to prove they'd fail as to prepare them for combat. Instead, they'd become the most requested escort unit in the theater, their distinctive red-tailed aircraft a welcome sight to bomber crews facing the gauntlet of German fighters. Marcus had grown up in Philadelphia, the son of a doctor and a schoolteacher, both of whom had scraped together every advantage they could give their 3 children despite the weight of segregation. He'd wanted to fly since watching a barnstormer at a county fair when he was 8, spent his teenage years building model aircraft and studying aerodynamics, applied to every aviation program that would accept black applicants, which meant he'd applied to exactly one. Tuskegee had been hell. Not just the flying, though, that was demanding enough, but the constant scrutiny, the knowledge that every mistake would be attributed not to an individual's failing, but to an entire race's supposed inadequacy. Their white instructors varied from grudgingly fair to openly hostile. They trained with older aircraft, insufficient spare parts, textbooks that were outdated. When they graduated and shipped overseas, they faced officers who doubted their competence, bomber crews who requested different escorts, a military structure that segregated them in every way except when bullets were flying. But they flew. And they were exceptional. This morning's mission was bomber escort to Plosti, the Romanian oil fields that fueled Germany's war machine. 200 B-17s and B-24s, each carrying enough explosives to flatten city blocks, would make the long flight over the Alps and into heavily defended airspace. The Luftwaffe would contest every mile. Marcus and his squadron would fly top cover, protecting the bombers from attacks while themselves being outnumbered and far from friendly territory. "Red Leader, this is Red 2. I've got you in sight." Lieutenant Samuel Pierce's voice crackled through the radio. Pierce was from Atlanta, had overcome segregated schools and Jim Crow laws to become one of the finest pilots Marcus had ever flown with. "Ready to dance?" "Copy that. Red 2. Stay sharp today." Intelligence says the Luftwaffe is desperate to stop this raid. They formed up with the bomber stream over the Adriatic. 50 Mustangs weaving protective patterns around the heavy bombers. Marcus scanned the sky constantly, searching for the deadly dots that would resolve into Messerschmitts or Focke-Wulfs. The bombers droned onward, maintaining formation despite the flak that began bursting in black flowers as they crossed into enemy airspace. "Bandits! 10 o'clock high," someone called. "Shh!" Marcus snapped his head around, spotted them. A dozen BF-109s diving from the sun. Classic attack formation. Red flight. Engage. "Stay with your bombers." He pushed his throttle forward, felt the Merlin engines roar through his entire body as the Mustang accelerated. The lead German fighter was growing in his gun sight, close enough now to see the mottled camouflage, the black crosses on its wings. Marcus waited, let the range close until he couldn't miss, then pressed the trigger. The P-51's 6.50 caliber machine guns hammered, tracers reaching out, converging on the 109. Metal tore. Smoke erupted. The German fighter broke away, trailing fire. Around him, the sky had become chaos, aircraft wheeling and diving. Contrails marking desperate maneuvers, tracers arcing in deadly geometry. Marcus cleared his tail, checked his mirrors, climbed back toward the bombers. A B-17 was trailing smoke from its number 3 engine, falling behind the formation, vulnerable. 2 109s were stalking it. Marcus dove after them, his Mustang building speed until the controls grew heavy. He came up behind the nearest German, fired a burst that missed, corrected, fired again. This time his rounds found their mark, stitching across the 109's fuselage. The aircraft rolled inverted and plummeted. The second German broke off his attack, recognizing the threat, tried to turn into Marcus's attack. But the Mustang was faster, more maneuverable at this altitude. Marcus stayed with him through the turn, pulled lead, fired. The 109 staggered, pieces flying from its wing, then nosed over into a terminal dive. "Red leader, you've got one on your 6? Marcus broke hard left, felt the G-forces crush him into his seat, saw tracers flash past his canopy. His vision grayed at the edges, tunnel vision from the crushing acceleration, but he kept turning, bleeding energy but denying the German a clean shot. Someone, Pierce maybe, flashed across his view and the German fighter exploded in a ball of flame. "Thanks, Red 2. That's what we're here for, Skipper." The mission continued. Hours of tension punctuated by brief violence, until finally the bombers released their loads over Ploesti and turned for home. Marcus counted his squadron, felt relief when all aircraft reported in. They'd lost no bombers under their protection, had destroyed 7 enemy fighters confirmed, had done their job. The mission report praised the bomber crew's accuracy. The escort fighters weren't mentioned. That night Marcus sat in the Colored Officers Club nursing a drink that tasted like medicinal alcohol because that's what it was, listening to the sounds of celebration from the White Officers Club across the base. Through the window he could see them, laughing, backslapping, sharing war stories. The Tuskegee Airmen shared their own stories in their own space, separated by rules that made no sense, by a system that couldn't reconcile their competence with its prejudices. "You ever wonder why we do this?" Pierce asked, slumping into the seat beside Marcus. "Fly for a country that treats us like dirt?" Marcus had asked himself that question 1,000 times. "Because somebody has to prove them wrong. Because if we don't, they'll say it's because we couldn't, not because we weren't allowed. Because maybe if we're good enough, brave enough, if enough of us die proving it, something might change. That's a hell of a price to pay for maybe. It's the only price they're offering." In northern Italy, James Walker's unit pushed deeper into the mountains, taking villages whose names he couldn't pronounce, losing men to German mines and artillery and snipers who could wait for hours for a single shot. I'd stopped counting the dead, stopped trying to remember all their names. Hayes was still alive, still cracking bitter jokes about the Army's incompetence, still keeping James grounded when the weight of it all threatened to crush him. They'd been in combat for 4 months now. James had killed men, watched friends die, endured cold and hunger and fear so constant it became a background hum. He'd proven himself 12 times over, earned a Bronze Star that somehow never made it through the paperwork. He'd learned that courage meant continuing when every instinct screamed to run, that brotherhood meant something deeper than shared skin color. That war stripped away everything civilized and left only the animal core of survival. The civilians changed things. In every town they liberated, Italian families treated them not as colored troops, not as second-class soldiers, but as liberators. Children ran to them with flowers, old women kissed their hands. Young women looked at them with something James hadn't seen in American eyes, something like equality. It was in these moments, sharing wine with farmers whose land had been freed from Nazi occupation, dancing in town squares to accordion music, that James felt almost human again. But then white American troops would arrive and the invisible walls would reassert themselves. MPs would harass black soldiers for fraternizing. White officers would commandeer the best quarters, the recognition would evaporate. James watched. Italian girls who danced with him the night before, forbidden by white soldiers from speaking to colored troops. He watched cafes that had welcomed him with open arms suddenly display whites-only signs installed by American military police. It was Hayes who articulated what they all felt. "We're good enough to die for them, but not good enough to sit at their tables. We're liberating countries from tyranny while they maintain their own tyranny over us." In December 1944, during the bitter cold of an Italian winter, James's company held a mountain pass against a German counteroffensive. For 3 days they fought in conditions that turned rifle action sluggish and froze water in canteens, against an enemy that was desperate and experienced. They held because they had no choice. Because retreat meant exposing the entire division's flank. Because their training and their courage and their determination exceeded every prejudiced expectation. When relief finally arrived, a white colonel surveyed the battlefield, counted the German dead, examined the defensive positions, and turned to Colonel Harrison. "Your men did well here." Single quotes. It was the first official recognition they'd received. James, standing nearby with frostbitten feet and 4 days of beard and exhaustion that went bone deep, waited for Harrison's response. "They did their duty," Harrison said flatly, and walked away. That night James cried for the first time since childhood, not from sadness but from rage so pure it had nowhere else to go. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. Germany surrendered, and across the continent soldiers celebrated, danced in streets, kissed strangers, let themselves believe they'd survived. The black troops of the 92nd, the 761st, the 332nd shared in the relief but not in the recognition. Their victories had been attributed to others, their casualties minimized, their heroism rendered invisible. Robinson's Tank Battalion participated in the liberation of multiple concentration camps, witnessed horrors that would haunt them forever, saw the ultimate expression of the racial hatred they'd fought against, only to return to a country that practiced its own version of the same evil. Marcus and the Tuskegee Airmen had compiled a combat record unmatched by any other fighter group, protecting bombers with such skill that losses among aircraft they escorted were the lowest in the theater. James and the men of the 92nd had fought through impossible terrain against determined opposition, died in mountains whose names would never be remembered in American history books. They shipped home in the summer of 1945 still in segregated transports, still separated from white troops by invisible lines that military victory had done nothing to erase. The reception was telling. White soldiers returned to ticker tape parades, to grateful politician speeches, to GI Bill benefits that would transform their lives. Black soldiers returned to Jim Crow, to segregated housing and employment discrimination, to lynchings that resumed as if they'd never worn the uniform. In Mississippi, a black veteran still wearing his uniform was beaten by a white mob for using the wrong water fountain. In Georgia, another was murdered for refusing to move to the back of a bus. Across the South, white communities made it clear that military service had changed nothing, that the old order would be maintained through violence if necessary. But something had changed, even if America wasn't ready to acknowledge it. The men who'd fought in Italy and France and Belgium, who'd flown over Germany and liberated concentration camps and bled on foreign soil, returned with a knowledge that couldn't be suppressed. They'd proven themselves in the ultimate test. They'd seen countries where race mattered less than character. They'd saved white soldiers who despised them and been thanked by strangers who judged them by their actions rather than their skin color. James Walker returned to North Carolina and found work on his father's farm. The Bronze Star he'd earned collecting dust in a drawer because wearing it invited trouble. But he also joined the local NAACP chapter, began organizing voter registration drives, carried with him the certainty that a country he'd bled for owed him more than segregation and second-class citizenship. Robinson went back to Chicago and used his GI Bill benefits, fought with officials who tried to deny him the housing loans white veterans received automatically, eventually opened a small garage where he repaired vehicles and mentored young men. Told them about Belgium, about holding the line when everything said to run. Marcus stayed in the Air Force when it finally integrated in 1948, became one of the first black pilots to fly jets, served in Korea. Retired as a colonel 20 years after the military had tried to prevent him from flying at all. He gave speeches at schools, told young people that excellence was its own resistance, that proving doubters wrong was an act of revolution. The three men never met, though their paths crossed in spirit through the growing civil rights movement. The soldiers who'd faced German bullets while enduring American racism became the foundation of a transformation. They'd learned organizing and discipline in military service. They'd learned that systems could be challenged and overcome. They'd learned that courage came in many forms, including the courage to demand equality in the face of violence. When Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of that bus in Montgomery, she did so knowing that men had worn military uniforms while being denied basic dignity. When the Little Rock Nine walked through screaming mobs to integrate Central High School, they walked with the knowledge that black pilots had protected white bomber crews who doubted their competence. When Martin Luther King spoke of an America that lived up to its ideals, he spoke to veterans who'd risked everything for ideals that had been denied to them. The full accounting of their service took decades. The 761st Tank Battalion received a Presidential Unit Citation in 1978, 33 years after their combat ended. The Tuskegee Airmen were awarded the Congressional Gold Medal in 2007, 62 years late. Individual heroes received belated recognition, medals presented to elderly men or their surviving families. Apologies that could never compensate for careers destroyed. Dignity denied. Lives lived under the shadow of institutionalized racism. But their greatest victory wasn't measured in medals or citations. It was measured in the young people who saw their example and refused to accept segregation, in the civil rights lawyers who used military service records to argue for equality before the law, in the slow, grinding transformation of a nation that had sent men to die for freedom while denying them that same freedom at home. James Walker lived to see the Civil Rights Act pass in 1964, watched on television as President Johnson signed legislation that should have been unnecessary, that acknowledged rights that should never have been questioned. He died in 1989, buried with military honors in a cemetery where black and white veterans lay in integrated rest that had been denied them in life. Robinson attended the dedication of a monument to the 761st Tank Battalion, stood with other elderly veterans in ill-fitting suits that couldn't hide the bearing of men who'd faced German armor with insufficient equipment and unlimited courage. He told a reporter that he didn't want thanks, wanted only for history to record what had actually happened, who had actually done the fighting, who had actually held the lines. Marcus flew his final mission in 1968, a ceremonial flight over Tuskegee in a restored P-51 painted with the distinctive red tail. Below him, a new generation of black pilots trained without the burden of segregation flew aircraft that his generation's service had made possible. He landed that plane and walked away from the cockpit knowing that every barrier broken made the next one easier, that every prejudice confronted made the next confrontation less daunting. The story of black troops in World War II is written in the contradictions of American democracy, in the distance between ideals and implementation, in the courage required to serve a nation that questioned your humanity while demanding your sacrifice. They fought two wars simultaneously, one against fascism abroad and another against racism at home. And their victory in the first made the eventual victory in the second inevitable. Their legacy isn't found in the battles they won, though they won many. It isn't found in the ground they captured or the enemies they killed, though they did both with competence that exceeded every prejudiced expectation. Their legacy is found in the transformation they sparked, the revolution they seeded, the future they made possible through service that should never have been questioned. They were soldiers before they were symbols, men before they were movements. But they became both through sacrifice that honored their country even when their country refused to honor them. They earned their place in history not through battlefield heroism alone, though they displayed that in abundance, but through the courage to continue serving despite every reason to refuse, to maintain dignity despite systematic humiliation, to believe in an America that did not yet exist, but that their service would help create. The mountains of Italy still stand where James Walker fought. The fields of Belgium still grow crops where Robinson's tank held the line. The sky over Germany still echoes, if you listen carefully, with the roar of Mustang engines flown by men who were told they couldn't fly. Their names are slowly being added to memorials, their stories finally being told, their place in victory finally being acknowledged. But for the men who served, recognition came too late to matter. What mattered was the knowledge they carried, the certainty they passed to their children and grandchildren that they had proven something essential, that courage has no color, that heroism cannot be segregated, that excellence transcends prejudice, that freedom, once tasted on foreign soil while liberating others, becomes impossible to deny at home. They fought for an America that betrayed them, and in doing so, forced America to confront its betrayal. They served a democracy that denied them its benefits, and in doing so, expanded that democracy's reach. They died for ideals that excluded them, and in doing so, made those ideals impossible to restrict. This is their story, written in blood and sacrifice, in courage and endurance, in the grinding patience required to change a nation that resisted change with every tool of oppression it possessed. They were the heroes behind Allied victories, though those victories were credited to others. They were the soldiers who proved that segregation was a lie, though that lie persisted for years after their service. They were Americans who demanded America live up to its promises, and in making that demand, transformed their nation into something closer to the ideal for which they'd fought. Their war didn't end in 1945. It continued through decades of struggle, through marches and sit-ins and voter registration drives, through court cases and legislation, and the slow erosion of institutional racism. They were the first wave of a battle that their children and grandchildren would continue, the foundation upon which the civil rights movement would build. And when the history is finally complete, when the full accounting is made of who won the war and at what cost, their names will stand alongside every other soldier who served with honor. Not in a separate list, not in a footnote, but in the main narrative of American courage, where they belonged from the beginning. They were soldiers. They were heroes. They were the men who faced segregation in the army yet became the heroes behind key Allied victories. And their victory, delayed and denied and hard-won, belongs to all of us.